My name is David Bowen, and I'm a studio artist whose work explores intersections between natural and mechanical systems, and often I make data-driven kinetic sculpture. My piece in the exhibition is titled Tele-Present Wind. For this installation, I have a dried plant stock, which is called tansy, on the roof of one of the labs at my university. And at the base of that plant stock is a device called an accelerometer, which basically measures tilt in X and Y directions. Data from that sensor is sent via computer in real time to a field of 126 devices that are connected to servo motors in the gallery space. And each servo tilts in X and Y direction based on the data that's being collected from the rooftop sensor back in Minnesota. And connected to those servo motors is also an individual plant stock. So there's 126 plant stocks. And so those are all moving in unison based on the data that's collected from the sensor in Minnesota. I'm very interested in the ways in which mechanical systems and natural processes sort of overlap. And for me, it really starts as like kind of a formal contrast, where you can see that these two are very disparate, I guess, on a very formal level. But as I dig deeper into these systems, I find it fascinating the way that maybe wind or water or even living things can behave in very predictable, almost mechanical ways. On the inverse side of that, I also find it kind of interesting when computers or machines kind of, I guess, screw up in interesting ways, like maybe do something unpredictable. And so I think for me, like adding the natural element to the computer or kind of overlapping those two is a way for me to kind of add some unpredictability into the system. And the outcomes are always, are generally unexpected. For example, tele-present wind, I don't look at it as an actual representation of the wind, but I look at it as more of a collaboration between the wind itself, me as the artist, and also the system, the way the system kind of responds to the input that it's given. So I think there's a lot more layers to it, and I become more and more fascinated with this intersection and find it less of a formal contrast the more I work with these kinds of systems. I also work with living things, living animals. I have another piece that uses flies to control a revolver, kind of making a commentary on the gun laws in the US there. And the flies are completely in control of a handgun. And basically they decide which direction it's aimed and when it is fired. And I actually exhibited this in Canada also at a space in Vancouver called the New Media Gallery back in 2017. The flies is kind of a stand-in for the absurd and kind of maybe pointing out some of the absurd nature of the laws, it seems, from my perspective. Another installation titled Tele-Present Water, and that is a wave mechanism that's undulating in the gallery space. And that is based on data that is taken from a NOAA data buoy. NOAA is the US National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. And they have these buoys all over the surface of the oceans, all over the world. And each buoy then has its own website, basically, URL that you can go to. And so I wrote a custom data scraper that will pull from that website of a particular buoy wave height and wave period data. And then that information can be mapped to the movement of the wave. And I find that like a kind of fascinating exploration as it relates to tele-present wind. That kind of mystery of what's happening over there, like what's happening in the middle of the ocean or what's happening in the location where I'm from. And so for these pieces, like for example, for tele-present wind, you'll notice in the installation, I don't have like a video monitor of the tansy stock that's blowing outdoors. And I did that on purpose. I mean, I've tried it that way and I didn't think it was as successful because it feels almost too didactic. I sort of like that mystery of what's going on. And our brains are left to kind of fill in the gap a little bit of like, you know, what is the wind doing? Is it coming out of the north? And you can always pull up your weather app and find out exactly what's going on. But I like that sort of, as I was saying before, like a mashup between the system, the data, the location, and myself as kind of putting these things together. So. I'm often inspired by a new piece of tech, I guess, in a lot of ways, like, or, you know, I'll obtain a certain sensor and kind of play around with it and then think about, well, what can I do with this? Like that's very inspirational to me. I'm not like a classically trained coder, so I think I go about the coding piece in a very different way. I think I'm doing a lot of hacking, let's say, of kind of, you know, figuring out what's working and then kind of repurposing that for my own sort of output, I guess, is the word I'm looking for. And so I think a lot of the pieces, like tele-present wind in particular, involves a lot of what's called mapping. So you're taking the data from the sensor and figuring out what the limits are of that and how far it can go, and then kind of mapping that to the movement of the servo. A lot of the installation that you see in the space here was digitally fabricated on a CNC machine. So like making the replicating the parts, and then the assembly phase. And then the final phase, which I think a lot of people don't see as much, but is very important, is what's called, I call it the debugging phase. So it's basically like if you have anything that's moving in a gallery, like, or is dependent on a computer or electricity, you gotta test that thing, right? You want it to be functioning. So you gotta run it for a very long period of time before each opening or before each install, just to see what's potentially gonna go wrong. I mean, even if you do this phase, sometimes things will not work, but it's the best chance we have to ensure that things function as best as they possibly can. So there's quite a bit of debugging phase, which is not the most glamorous thing ever, but it's very necessary. Like, what's gonna break? Where are the weak points in this? And what do you need to make it a little bit more robust? For a tele-present wind in particular, the idea that the viewer can walk in amongst the plant stalks and kind of be a part of the installation and kind of experience the wind, or I guess experience not the wind, but like the physical effects of the wind in the space. And so I think of that as like, to answer your question about physical space. And then virtual, I think, yeah, there's some of that going on too. And I think we're thinking a lot these days about virtual reality and, you know, kind of immersing ourselves in these environments. And I think of some of my sculptures, at least, as physical ways of doing that. Again, not necessarily trying to recreate a representation, but more of kind of a mashup of the physical activity and the space and the viewer becoming part of that.